Over to you.
So hopefully you can see my slides on the screen. So I work alongside Gina, as she's already said. I'm an economics teacher, and I've taught a bit of business studies and IT in the past as well. I also work with Gina in boarding, so we have lots of international students, and I'm head of sixth form at St Joe's as well. So that's a bit of my background. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is effective plenaries. And I'm sure many of you have used plenaries before in some way, often part of a three-part lesson, which people speak of repeatedly as the gold standard for a lesson. But just in case, what do we mean by this? So it's any activity that reviews the achievement of lesson objectives. It helps consolidate learning. It can be used for some kind of assessment for learning to check how much people have understood. And it can also be used as a gauge for how confident students feel about a topic. And as I said, this idea of a three-part lesson with a starter and a main and a plenary is seen, at least in UK schools, it was seen as the gold standard. And almost if you were having a lesson observation, or an Ofsted or an ISI inspection, or it was seen almost that your lesson plan should reflect that three-part lesson style, or somehow you would be failing. And I know in sort of teaching circles now, perhaps things have moved on a little bit from there, and people have questioned whether a lesson has to have that exact structure anymore. But I still see that a plenary can be a very, very, very useful element at the end of a lesson, or at part way through the lesson, mini plenaries as you go along, to achieve these sort of checks on learning and to help students consolidate. It's almost a bit like interleaving within your lesson and going back and reviewing and checking as you go along. But it depends how you do it. So if you're just having a plenary for the sake of a plenary, just so you can show on a lesson plan, there is something called an activity that you're calling a plenary, that doesn't necessarily help. You have to think about what you're trying to achieve, whether it's consolidating learning, whether it's you checking on someone's confidence, or you've got to think a bit more about the purpose of your plenary rather than just thinking, oh, I haven't done my three parts, I must have a plenary at the end. So I'm going to have a little sort of talk about that and give you some little ideas for plenaries that you may or may not have seen. And then maybe at the end, if you've used some very good plenaries, maybe you might be able to share your ideas as well. So what are we trying to achieve? Now, part of it will depend on the type of learning you're trying to achieve within your lesson. So I'm sure many of you have seen Bloom's taxonomy before, where you see the complexity of learning and skill development growing as you go up this pyramid, where some lessons might be just about knowledge and gaining terms and basic concepts, but you can see as we go up, we comprehend, we learn how to apply those, we analyze, synthesize, eventually we learn to evaluate. These are much more complex, higher level skills as we get higher up this taxonomy. And our plenaries might reflect different aspects of learning as well. So if we can try and think a bit more about, sometimes a plenary might be useful in terms of just doing a quick check on what basic knowledge has been picked up, terms and concepts. But other times we might want to push it further and try and check and consolidate higher level skills as well. So I'm going to give you some examples, first of all, of plenaries that might be used to be able to do those basics of checking knowledge. And they can be particularly useful for very, very quick plenaries, something that's punchy at the end, and often something that can be very fun as well for the students. And then I'm going to show how perhaps we can start stretching it a little bit higher up that taxonomy. So if we're thinking here just about basic recall, if you've presented a whole load of new concepts, can the students remember the names of those concepts? And these sorts of plenaries are useful whether you're teaching in primary schools or in secondary. What you're expecting the students to produce will be, depending on what subjects you've covered. A very common one that you may have come across is this idea, we call it gimme five or give me five, the 5 fingers on your hand. And you could simply ask the students to jot down at the end of the lesson 5 ideas or 5 words or 5 anything at all from your lesson to show that they have picked things up, and then you can go around the class and find out what the 5 were. You can add interest to the game to see if anyone came up with a unique bit of their 5. So you could ask people to put down 5 things that they've remembered, but they get a bonus mark if they get something that's unique. So that's quite a simple one and just gets people going, and it's very, very fast to do. Something that's more lively and more fun, and the students really engage in it, would be this idea of a you say we pay game. Now, if you're in the UK, you would know what we mean by that if you're of a certain age, because it refers to a game show on TV. So in this picture, you can see these people here are called Richard and Judy, and they used to be the king and queen of daytime TV in the UK. And they used to have a game on there called You Say We Pay. And the screen behind them, where you can see the words, pictures or words or something would come up behind them, and they couldn't see what was on the screen. And then television viewers would call in and would have to describe what's on the screen without saying the word, and they would have to guess the answer. Now, I play this regularly with students, and they enjoy it a lot, and it can get quite loud in the classroom. If you have 2 students that come and sit up at the front, and you split the class into 2 teams, and they've got 1 representative from each of their teams up the front, you put a concept up on the board behind them. It could be a keyword, a definition or something, and then you ask their teammates to shout out explanations of that term, and their teammates at the front have to try and guess it, and they get a point for each one they get right. And it can work really, really well where you're testing the concepts of that particular lesson, but you can also keep building. So if you did this once every couple of weeks, you can keep building in the new concepts, but ones from earlier in the term as well. So it's not necessarily checking the understanding hugely, because it's just key terms, but when they have to describe the key terms, it's possible that sometimes they might have to explain the meaning of those key terms, to be able to explain it without saying the term itself. I hope that makes sense. So it can develop. It depends on your students. It's quite loud, and it's quite fun, and the students really, really like it. If we draw, you can tell I'm a TV addict. If you want to think a bit more about higher level skills and getting the students to think more in their plenaries, we can borrow from another TV show called Jeopardy. Now, Jeopardy is a TV show from the United States. It's an old show. And the idea of this is in the show, the contestants would be given a clue by given the answer to a question. And then what would happen is they would have to give their responses in the form of questions. So they're guessing the question, if that makes sense. So for example, if at the end of this session, I said the answer is plenary, and asked you to write a question where that would be the answer, then it would be making you think much more about the concept. So if I'd simply said to you, what is the name of a session or an activity that takes place at the end of a lesson, and ask students to consolidate, summarize, or something like that, you'd have just said plenary, and it would have been very, very easy. But if I said to you, the answer's plenary, what is the question? It makes you think much more, and that can get students using their thinking skills and generally having to reflect much more on the material that you've covered. Another one, which also requires thinking and might make them think much more about connections as well, is this idea of the connectives games. So if we know from our language learning that connectives are words such as and, because, but, however, such, you get the idea. I'm sure many of you speak multiple languages, so you will have a much more developed idea of language learning. You can use a game where you put up a statement, and then the students have to finish the statement using a connective and then finishing it off. So, for example, I've written down here at the bottom, the global economy is in recession, and then I'm an economics teacher, so then the students might have to finish that off in terms of, saying, because we've had a global pandemic which has caused shutdowns, and they might go on and talk about it. But if it was a primary school thing, it could be, we wash our hands because, or we wash our hands, and then they put the connective of because, or and so on, and then they finish it off. But it makes them think more rather than just asking them a direct question. And actually it allows for some variety around the class where students are putting in lots of different answers. And sometimes it can be really nice if they're not just writing, because you know, if they're writing a however, you know, we wash our hands, however there aren't always facilities available, or I don't know, something like that. We wash our hands, but keeping a distance might be better, something along those lines. You can get them to try and use different connectives, and you can play around and remove connectives to make it harder for them as well. This one is a really good one, and this is the idea of getting these students at the end of a session to write instructions to themselves at the beginning of the next lesson. So it's really, really important that we have a continuance of learning when we have a stream of lessons that are all linked to each other. And it can be very frustrating if you go into your next lesson and then the recall of what they've learned from the last lesson, it takes, you waste a big chunk of the beginning of your next lesson by having to re-explain and summarize everything that you taught in the previous one. So this idea of creating an instructable is that the students themselves write a note to themselves in their own language that gives them an update, so that you can start in very quickly knowing what happens. And actually, because at the beginning of the next lesson they will have remembered writing those instructions, their recall of it is much better in the first place. Now this could take different forms, so it could be simply writing some words about summarizing what took place, so it's their instructions, so they're up to speed. But it could be that they are writing a flow diagram or drawing a diagram to represent what's been taught in the previous lesson. And that will encourage them, because it's a more, they have to think more about how they put it into diagrammatic form. It can be much more useful in terms of recall and memory. Something that I do, because I teach economics and we have a lot of diagrams in economics, sometimes I use this when I'm asking students to remember how to draw a diagram. So it might be that they have to remember the order that they would draw it. And that can be a very, very useful one. So the starter at the next lesson might be who can draw accurately, a price discrimination diagram. And then the students can use their own instructions to help them remember how to draw that diagram. So it depends what you're teaching, but instructables can be very, very useful. You just have to be a bit creative about how you use it. So that was all about subject development. And even with these ones where I'm sort of trying to highlight to you that we're developing higher level skills, you could still go further. You could have more complex tasks, or ones that stretch their knowledge, or that create opportunities for those analysis, synthesis, evaluation type skills. But I haven't put them in any specific ones in there, because they're often much more subject specific when they get to that higher level. But hopefully you can see from the ones that were basic recall to these sort of games or instructables where they have to think a bit more, you're already developing higher level skills. The other thing that we can do when we are using a plenary is using it as a way of sort of assessing confidence. And this can be done well or not well. I've seen a lot of teachers have used traffic light systems or exit cards, where students will literally hold up a green, amber or red card to say how happy or sad they are about a topic, or or they fill in a slip and tick a box. And there is some use in doing that, because when you know your students well, if a student says they are confident on something and you know they're not the student that would say that without being sure of it, it might be an okay thing to do. But often it's a bit limited as to what can happen. So one that I prefer is this idea of a phone a friend. And this idea is you ask students at the end of the lesson to write down a question that you need a friend to be able to answer, something from that lesson that you're a little bit stuck on, the area where there's the most problems. So it's not just saying, are you happy or sad about something? Because a lot of students will tend to just say they're fine about everything, so that they don't get quizzed on it. But if you actually say, right, of the lesson, what was the thing you found most difficult? Write it down as a phone a friend question and hand it in. The teacher can then review it and then work out areas that might need a bit more work for the next lesson. And depending on the level of IT you have in your classroom, there's quite a few possibilities for this to be done electronically as well. So if you are well equipped in your classroom, you could put this in as a quick quiz and it's done and collated electronically. But it worked perfectly well on a paper-based system as well. So there you go. There's a quick snapshot of some different ideas about plenaries for consolidating learning, getting subject recall, developing higher level skills, trying to assess whether students are confident. But the key thing is to choose the plenary that achieves what you want to achieve. Just having a plenary for the sake of a plenary could be a wasted 5 minutes. And what you really need to do is think first about what you're trying to achieve and then find a plenary that matches. So that's the end. Just a quick snapshot for you. If you've got any questions, I can see something came up on the chat then. But if not, perhaps post your favourite plenary and why, and of your own or one that I've said, and then it might stimulate a nice chat and we could share from each other. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen. We've got a few hands up. Let me just see. I presume these are questions. Let me unmute Sitamini. I think you're unmuted. Could be wrong. Zoom is quite temperamental. Sitamini, yes. If you unmute yourself, I think. Right, let me go. Oh, nope, she's gone. There was another question. Let me see if the person is still here. Runmally had a question. Let me see if I can find her. Unmute Runmally. I think it was a question. Let's find out.